Hello, welcome back to this introduction to relational psychoanalysis, in which we are doing an overview of Stephen A. Mitchell's book, Relational Concepts in Psychoanalysis. So in the last video, we gave a very broad overview of the field of psychoanalysis. And this was primarily to better contextualize Mitchell's relational conflict model and understanding it as a third option apart from drive theory and developmental arrest models. Today we are going to go more into the primary theorists that come to support the relational conflict model. Now, one of the main goals of this book is to integrate the various schools and various theorists of psychoanalysis. And one of the ways Mitchell is able to do this integration is through his concept of a multifaceted relational matrix. The relational matrix is primarily a lens in which we can understand and perceive all psychological phenomena. And it's a lens that allows us to draw upon multiple theorists simultaneously within our conceptualizations of patients. So to begin, Mitchell explains that there are three primary facets to the relational matrix: the self, the object, or other, and the space between. So what Mitchell does here is that he sees that each theorist appears to emphasize a different facet within the relational matrix. And the particular facet that they come to emphasize comes down to how they explain why we are relational. So the explanations they give actually locate them within the relational matrix and allows us to use a particular theory to really flesh out and understand a particular facet within the relational matrix. Mitchell identifies three primary explanations as to why we are relational, and each one corresponds to a different facet within the relational matrix. So we have relational by design, relational by intent, and relational by implication. Let's start with the first category here, which is relational by design. And the theorists that Mitchell puts within this category are Bowlby and Sullivan. So attachment theory and interpersonal psychoanalysis. And this category he sees as being focused on the space between the self and the other. And by relational by design, he means that these theorists see that we are relational because we are fundamentally built that way. And they're both different. Bowlby takes a much more biological understanding and approach to this relational need. That it's rooted in our DNA, it's rooted in our self as a species to seek proximity with others. And it's different also from Freud's thinking, because attachment is not seen as a kind of discharge or a relief of some kind of biological tension that may be related to a certain zone, like a need, like an oral need. It's really that the relationship, the contact with the mother is primary, that is the need that the infant is seeking. It's not that he's looking for her to satisfy other more important biological needs. And there is research that supports this notion too. It's really interesting that an infant's eyes don't converge when they're first born, don't converge around the breast. They converge about 8 inches from the infant's face, which is about the same distance that the mother would have to the infant while breastfeeding. So it seems that even the infant's eyes are geared not towards the breast, but are geared towards having this relational, eye to eye, face to face experience with their mother. With Sullivan and interpersonal psychoanalysis, the focus is not so much on this more biological kind of species based idea of relationships, but just seeing the personality as formed by relationships. That the personality, the very nature of a personality, is a personality that is developed in order to respond and navigate social interaction. So the personality is responsive and adaptive to the social field. And that is really the only way to think about the nature of personality, to try to think about personality as something separate that is informed by our particular genes and then comes to interact with the social environment, is erroneous for Sullivan. That we need to think of the personality as a response and an adaptation to the interpersonal field, and that this is simply the way we are designed. This is simply the nature of the personality to respond and adapt to the social field. So what Mitchell suggests is that the theorists that emphasize relational by design have seemed to help us understand the space between the self and the other within the relational matrix. So that these theorists are looking at the actual interactions that are happening, in particularly between the analyst and the analysand, or the therapist and the patient, as well as between the mother and the infant. So focusing less on the intrapsychic world of the analysand and more on these concrete, actual transactions between people. So the next major category is relational by intent. And what separates this from relational by design is that we are not looking at ourselves as a species, kind of objectively, that we objectively need relationships and that we can kind of use scientific data to support this, but more that we are looking at the need for relationships as a phenomenological fact, like a clinical deduction, that we have this subjective intent, this craving to be in relationship and to maintain relationships. So the focus here is on the intrapsychic, on the internal world. And when we look into that world, when we explore it, we see a relational intent. We see a powerful movement towards others. And the major theorist that represents this relational by intent is Fairbairn. So the British School of Object Relations. In Fairbairn's model, we are motivated to seek out contact with significant others and to maintain this contact. And the idea here is that that contact is what is primary, not the pleasure that is derived from it. Fairbairn challenged Freud's model by saying that libido is not pleasure-seeking, but object-seeking. And that pleasure is more of a vehicle for maintaining contact with the object. And the major point here is that what becomes important is the particular qualities of the object. And those qualities become more important than what the object does for us. And often it is it often the object is not allowing us to feel good or pleasurable at all, but may actually elicit very negative emotional states from us. But we maintain those negative emotional states because it signifies closeness. So for Fairburn, the idea is that the child finds a way of connecting with the family, a way in. And that way in is often the parents' character pathology, where they are fixated emotionally. And that fixation is often a painful one. It can be a depressive longing or a rageful indignation. And the parents exist here, and the child feels that and wants to feel close to that because that is what is most emotionally alive in their relationship with their parents. And they come to internalize this emotional state, this pathology, this fixation of the parent. They internalize it and come to identify with it. And that identification allows them to feel close with their parents even when their parents are distant. And this comes to explain a lot of psychopathology. And it also explains why people have difficulty getting better and changing and allowing for more positive relationships and more positive emotional states. It's because this change signifies abandonment. It signifies disconnection and loss from those original, hugely important, significant others of childhood. So within this category, Mitchell also puts Klein, Melanie Klein. In particular, her emphasis on gratitude and reparation towards the good object. And even though Klein was heavily focused on constitutional factors, so our drives as kind of governing psychopathology, and really de-emphasizing and almost completely negating the environment as having a significant role. But what Mitchell states here is that if we look at Melanie Klein's concepts within the lens of Fairburn's model, they take a different light and they become more dyadic. And we can fit them into a more dyadic model. So for example, seeing that that envious spoiling can be seen as an actual reaction to failures of our parents, as well as that desire and that urge for reparation can be an actual, or it can be a reaction to the actual sufferings that a child experiences from their parents, that they see, that the suffering they see within their parent. So Mitchell is saying that we can utilize, and in particular Fairburn, but also Klein, to understand the object pole, the other pole of the relational matrix. And not understanding the patient's relationships with others through the lens of actual transactions that may be happening in the clinical encounter, but exploring their intrapsychic life, their fantasy life, the reoccurring themes, the reoccurring patterns that dominate their internal world, and understanding these close ties to these identifications with early significant others. So now we can move on to relational by implication. And here we are focusing on the self pole. And these theorists emphasize the importance of our need to develop and maintain a sense of self across time. And these theorists agree that relationships are needed to facilitate this. That in order to feel a sense of self-cohesion, a sense of integrity, that we need relationships to mirror and help us develop this capacity. So in a sense, the need for a self implicates us into relationship. So the main theorists here are Winnicott and Kohut. Both of these theorists put a lot of emphasis on the development of the self. In Winnicott's model, the infant requires a facilitating environment in which the mother is able to respond to the infant's needs to the point where the infant experiences a sense of what Winnicott called subjective omnipotence. So essentially that the infant comes to believe that their needs actually cause the satisfaction of their needs. So that for example, when the infant is hungry and suddenly the breast is in his mouth, subjectively there is a sense that he is in control of the breast and that he willed the breast into existence. And it's these moments, and it doesn't need to be at a kind of permanent state, but his famous term, good enough. These moments and these experiences of subjective omnipotence form the basis of a real sense of self. And eventually, the mother or the caregiver introduces the infant to objective reality, to the reality of herself as a self that is separate from the infant. But it is these original moments of mirroring and attuning to the infant's needs and meeting them that allow the infant to eventually develop a healthy sense of self. And in Kohut's model, it's actually quite similar, but with very different terms. And Kohut really focused on this idea of narcissistic development, that we almost have a separate stream of psychic development that is focused on our narcissism, our libidinal investment in the self. And that we need what are called self-objects in the environment to help develop this. And these are, and self-objects are relationships where we feel mirrored in our rudimentary early grandiosity, as well as that we can idealize these objects, feel them, experience them as omnipotent and all-powerful. In Kohut's model, it is the slow, inevitable failures of these self-objects that allow us to internalize and develop a more realistic but robust sense of ourself. So Mitchell, similar to all the other theorists we've been talking about, all the other categories we've been talking about, emphasizes that we can use Kohut and Winnicott in particular to understand this self-pole. And understand that at times the patient may be drawing us into a relationship in which they can maintain and compensate for this more faulty, more weak, more false sense of themselves. So to recap this, within this chapter, Mitchell was able to provide an overview of the relational matrix and groups it up into three primary categories: the self, object/other, and the space between. And he shows us how different theorists help us understand the different dimensions of the relational matrix. And the major point here is that we do not need to undervalue or overvalue any of these dimensions, that all of these dimensions are important, and thus all the theoretical contributions are important. And here is a quote that really beautifully captures this integrative model that Mitchell is building here. To assign priority to sense of self, object ties, or patterns of interaction is like trying to decide whether it is the skin, the bones, or the musculature that preserves the body form. The sense of self, like the skin, is generally closer to the surface, nearer to consciousness, and provides a continuous surface and shape in the flow of mental life. Ties to others, like the bones, are often not visible to the naked eye, but provide an underlying skeletal framework which holds experience together. Characteristic patterns of interaction, like the musculature, make possible the action in which both self-experience and object relations take place. Just as the different dimensions of the physical body contribute simultaneously and interdependently to the preservation of physical existence, so these different dimensions of the relational matrix are indispensable facets of the analytic inquiry. So just a really beautiful metaphor there to capture what he is attempting to do by categorizing the relational matrix in this way. So that covers this section. The next video will go a bit more into how to fit drive theory into this more dyadic, more relational thinking. Thank you.